Chapter 2. Any Port in a Storm. PIU's Deputy Director was wearing a packet of brandy snaps in the common room. Porter joined her at the table and removed her hat. Sue tried not to gape at Porter's waif-like luminosity, but dark circles did little to dull her appearance. "No joy on the house front, then?" she asked, pushing the snaps across the table. Caught in the act of snacking, she felt an obligation to share. Porter's expression said it all. "Would the Dean mind if I pitch a tent on the lawn?" "Not if you pay him rent," smiled Sue. Rent was the least of Porter's worries. Locality, rather than budget, was the issue. She was keen to live within the city's wall. "I thought the house you viewed this morning looked promising," said Sue. "Looks can be deceptive," muttered Porter. To be fair to the property, the double-fronted terrace was not without charm. A tad frayed, perhaps, but ivy was masking much of its neglect. Porter had been rifling for the bell when the door opened without provocation. The herbaceous border had suffered her surprise. A disembodied voice demanded Porter left the garden to the gardener. Something had brushed against Porter's leg as she stumbled into the gloom. Her response had been nothing short of fruity. "Sherbet, you are a naughty kitty," the voice admonished. "Come on, I'll show you the room." Mrs. Wren's grip had compelled Porter to comply. "Blue hair and tweed are popular with the folk of York if my mum and her friends are anything to go by," informed Sue. "And cats," added Porter. Mrs. Wren had admitted to 9, not including the strays. Porter's nose was still stinging from the stench of ammonia. "Were they all alive?" asked Sue. "Well, if being cooped up all day is living, then yes." "And the room?" pressed Sue. "A windowless cupboard with a fondness for damp. At least the mildew masks the smell of pee," grimaced Porter. Sue flicked to the property section in the local paper where she had circled the advertisement for Porter. "It lists 4 en suites. What happened to the other 3? "Quadrupeds got there first," said Porter, taking her frustration out in a brandy snap. "Oh, something will turn up," consoled Sue. "Where? Guatemala?" "Well, at least you'll enjoy decent coffee," Sue tried to lighten the mood. "Fancy one?" "Make it an Irish." Porter was forced to settle for an Americano instead. Sue struggled to her feet to make drinks. PIU's Deputy Director was as wide as she was tall, which was impressive considering she towered over most men. Yet the woman was unperturbed by her ever-expanding girth. How the 51-year-old continued to dodge the diabetes bullet was anyone's guess. Sue put it down to good genes. Her doctor, a miracle. "How was your meeting with Mrs. Hewitt?" asked Sue while rinsing the cafetiere. Porter had arranged to meet Mrs. Hewitt after her viewing. Following directions to Lindley Close, Porter had found a troubled woman convinced she was being haunted by her mother. "When did she die?" asked Sue. "It's still on her to-do list. Mrs. Walters lives in a care home in Heslington." Sue frowned. "Are we the right sort of psychologists?" The possibility that Mrs. Hewitt was imagining the activity had struck Porter, but her complaint seemed genuine enough. Sue trusted Porter's judgment. "How did she hear about us?" Porter delved into her bag for the newspaper article Lovegrove had instigated. Mrs. Hewitt had it pinned to her fridge. "God, my hair's a mess," Sue recalled at the photograph of PIU staff, yet being a cream bun shy of a heart attack failed to alarm. "I'm glad Mrs. Hewitt got in touch." "She didn't have a choice. Her husband has given her an ultimatum. It's medication or us." Mrs. Hewitt was a woman close to breaking point. Her wasted form had quivered continually from a diet of caffeine and nicotine, while lank hair scraped back in a cursory manner did little to soften the cadaverous shell. Her waxy skin reminded Porter of her grandmother on viewing her 3 days dead. Mrs. Hewitt's quaking hands had never been without a cigarette. The woman had talked of her mother's behaviour, which had grown increasingly erratic. Mrs. Hewitt had employed carers, thinking her mother would benefit from help, but Mrs. Walters was rude to them, and they stopped coming. Mrs. Walters wanted to live with her daughter, which had driven Mrs. Hewitt to gin. "That evil bitch moves in over my dead body," Mr. Hewitt had snarled, snatching the bottle and downing what was left. So Mrs. Walters had found herself dumped in a care home. There was not enough gin to lessen her pain. Mrs. Hewitt's guilt was all-consuming. "You must think I'm a terrible daughter," she had told Porter while lighting one cigarette with another. Porter didn't judge. She had a mother too. The activity had started 6 weeks ago, the day the Hewitts had driven Mrs. Walters to Elm House. Mrs. Walters had been waiting for them on her driveway, accessorised with 2 small cases and an umbrella stand. She had never owned an umbrella. Mrs. Hewitt had thought it dismal that a woman of 70 could fit her life into 2 tiny containers, But then Mrs. Walters had never been attached to anything, including her children. Mum says I ramble, Mrs. Hewitt had told Porter. You'd think she's perfect the way she carries on. Frank says if nagging was an Olympic sport, Mum would be a gold medalist. Mum usually nags in the car because she knows I can't escape, but she just sat there po-faced. She even put her fingers in her ears when I tried to make conversation. Mrs. Walters still refused to speak when they arrived at the care home. Mrs. Hewitt had been embarrassed by her mother's behaviour, but Porter doubted the other residents cared. Mrs. Hewitt said her mother had made her life hell, but she still felt sorry for her. Not sorry enough to let her move in, said Sue dryly. The Hewitts had been exhausted after a long day. Mr. Hewitt had retired early, leaving Mrs. Hewitt settled in front of the television catching up on her programmes. I was watching Deer Breakers when the lounge suddenly got really cold. I thought Frank must have left a window open by mistake, but he hadn't. I turned up the heating, but it didn't make a blind bit of difference. Mrs. Hewitt worried she'd caught a bug from the care home. They were breeding grounds for germs after all. She was so cold she was forced to give up on her programmes and go to bed. Mr. Hewitt had been fast asleep. Mrs. Hewitt had attempted to read, but eventually gave up because her hands were shaking so hard from the frigid air. Her husband had slept on regardless. Mrs. Hewitt wasn't surprised. He once slept through an earthquake while holidaying in Mallorca. Porter thought that a skill worth boasting about. It's when I turned off the light to settle down that I saw someone at the foot of the bed. A woman, claimed Mrs. Hewitt in a hushed tone. The outside light shines through the curtains, you see. She was just standing there, staring. A quivering hand reached for a fresh packet of cigarettes. I thought my heart was going to burst out of my chest. Honestly, I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I was convinced I was being burgled. Mrs. Hewitt relived her panic. Our neighbour was burgled last month, but she slept through the whole thing. Porter's, she shares the same skill as your husband then, had inspired a weak smile. Mrs. Hewitt had been too scared to wake her husband. She didn't want to reveal the fact she was awake, so she'd simply laid there and waited for the intruder to raid them and leave. The intruder had never moved. A car driving past had lit up the room. Mrs. Hewitt shuddered at the memory of her mother's glare. What did she do? Sue asked breathlessly. She screamed and her mother vanished. Tears had filled the agony etched across Mrs. Hewitt's face. She had asked Porter if all her clients were such a mess. Some, admitted Porter. Human nature was far from prescriptive. Mrs. Hewitt had stopped worrying the ashtray. Her shoulders relaxed a little. Sue reached into the fridge for the milk. Did Mr. Hewitt see her too? No, he assumed his wife had had a nightmare after a trying day. He could be right, said Sue, conscious stress was at the heart of many complaints. Mrs. Hewitt thinks her mother will do anything to torment her, including breaking an entry, Sue gave Porter a sardonic look. She doesn't need to. She has a key, revealed Porter. Mrs. Hewitt gave it to her when they bought the house. Her husband wasn't happy when she told him to. I bet he wasn't. Doesn't sound like Mrs. Hewitt is helping herself. Perhaps it's time to change the locks. Well, that doesn't explain how Mrs. Walters melted into thin air, said Porter. Mrs. Hewitt phoned Elm House. She assumed the staff would find an empty bed, but Mrs. Walters was sound asleep. Mrs. Hewitt thought she must have had a nightmare after all. And that wasn't until 2 days later when it happened again. And it keeps happening. What does her husband think? Asked Sue. Mr. Hewitt was conscious of a drop in temperature whenever his wife complained of seeing her mother, but he had never seen the apparition firsthand. She's worried that he thinks she's losing her mind. She suffers from anxiety on account of her mother, explained Porter. Well, anxiety can induce hallucinations, agreed Sue. Porter wanted to investigate. She was enjoying the novelty of selecting her own cases. Her former boss had never been so accommodating. I'll let you tell Mike, she said darkly. Mike Roddick was the other paranormal investigator employed by PIU. A lifelong skeptic of all things paranormal and a veteran of investigation, Mike knew ghouls were nothing more than the schemes of the living. A pay rise had enticed Mike to apply for the job. He had been stagnating with Lovegrove anyway. And if he had to spend his days patronising gullible people, more money helped to sugar the pill. But Mike had not factored Porter into the equation. He, like Fergus, never thought she would accept a job north of the Watford Gap. He detested Porter and everything she stood for, and he made no secret of the fact. He thought her a fantasist. She thought him a fool. Content with their views, neither were inclined to revise them. Oh, don't worry about Mike. I've just given him 2 new cases, said Sue, hiding her treats in a filing cabinet. Porter eyed her questioningly. Well, Fergus doesn't like us keeping food in here. He's worried about rats. Porter thought he should be more concerned about Professor Lovegrove. Sue had filled her in on PIU's backstory of petty jealousies and sour grapes. Fergus can look after himself. It helps that Lovegrove is persona non grata with the Dean, said Sue. The Dean has adopted Fergus as his go-to man. He wants PIU to do well because he's hoping the donor will give him more money on the back of it. Having relinquished her life in London, Porter mirrored the Dean's desire for success. No wonder Lovegrove's nose is out of joint, she said. Oh, he'll get over it in time. Say it with a little more conviction, Sue, and even you might believe it, suggested Porter. Anyway, this isn't helping me find a home. You're welcome to stay with me for as long as you want. I'm glad to have another female in the house, confessed Sue, who cohabited with an alpha male and 3 teenage sons. Porter doubted Mr. Wainwright felt the same, having walked in on her failing at Pilates. We should have knocked first, Sue blamed her husband. Anyway, it does him good to see someone exercising. His trainers have been harvesting mould for a decade. Don't rush into anything, Porter. Take time to acclimatise. Sue had a point. The accent, the weather, strangers smiling were but a few of the things Porter was getting used to. Northerners were known to be friendly, well, unless they worked in the parapsychology department, apparently. Sue glanced at the clock. I'd better go. Does your talk start at 7? Fine. I might be late, but I'll get there as soon as I can. She left Porter skimming the properties again in the hope one may have slipped through the net. Porter returned to her desk, disappointed.